Everybody is talking about a housing crash. And of course, what do clients do? They wait for a housing crash. So I just want to do a quick video about the housing crash that people may have already missed. And to do that, we need to do two things. Firstly, we need to just talk about the word crash. The housing market has never crashed in history. Yes, it's pulled back. Most markets do. But the pullbacks have been over a very prolonged period of time. So this idea of a crash is highly unlikely to happen because it's never happened before. I think the term crash should be used for things that fall maybe 50% in a really short space of time, not that something that pulls back over 10, 15, 20% over 5 years. And then to think about this period in time specifically, we need to go right back to 2008. And the banks were licking their wounds because they'd lent too much money at high risk and the high end of the market. So some banks were lending 100% of the property value. Other banks were lending up to 125% of the property value on the assumption that house prices would continue to go up, and that extra 25% could be used for perhaps renovation to improve the property price. But of course, in 2007, house prices fell. And lots of banks found themselves in a position that they didn't want to be in, where they had to repossess properties and cut their losses. So what the banks did for the 10 years after that time is be uber cautious. So the banks were lending a maximum of something around 75% loan to value, which is obviously a huge decrease on what they were doing on the lead up to 2007, 2008. So when the banks were being cautious, what does that do to the property market? Well, if you have a look at large parts of the country, the number of housing transactions happening every single year stayed fairly flat, with the exception of 2016, where there was a stamp duty change for additional homes. So the revenue brought in an additional 3% for those people purchasing a buy-to-let or investment property. And we saw a huge spike in the number of transactions coming into the market. Also, property values took a very long time to recover. So they dropped after 2008. And personally, I bought a property in 2007. That property price came to full recovery in 2017. So it took 10 years for my personal property to recover in value. So if you look at the 10 years after 2008, property volumes were fairly static and property values were fairly static. So what does that do? It causes an enormous pent-up demand. COVID then hit, we came out of lockdown, and people had this perception of race for space, where people were locked up in their homes, and if, let's use central London for example, if you had a flat worth £500,000 and it's a one bed and you're locked up there for 2 months doing Zoom calls, team calls, being able to work as normal, you're probably thinking, well, why shouldn't I move outside of London now? For £500,000 you can buy something maybe, with a reasonable sized garden, 3 bedrooms, plenty more room, and still earn the same income from your employer because you can now work remotely. So that caused a really high demand post-lockdown, which caused a spike in transactions, a spike in property values. And of course, being the pessimistic race that we are, everybody thought that once everything goes up sharply, it is bound to come down again. People have been plugging this for some time now, but we're good 3 years on, and property prices have only dropped 5%. 5% doesn't resonate with anybody as being the crash that's being talked about. But there is one point that not many people are talking about, and that is over that time, inflation spiked rapidly. So when inflation levels are high, or when there is positive inflation, the price of everything goes up. So the price of a Freddo goes up, which costs you more money. But if you own an asset, the cost of that asset also goes up. So if you own a property, your property is now worth more pounds sterling than it was the years prior. because the cost of the pound or the value of the pound is going down. So when people say, and when the data says that property prices have dropped 5%, well, that's the price versus the pound sterling, because that's how you measure it in this country, obviously. But in reality, if you adjust for inflation, property prices have actually fallen 15%. Now, if the data showed a 15% drop, a lot of people would be saying, the drop's happened, what do we do now? Well, we probably stagnate for a little bit and then we start to recover and rise again, as most markets do. And we're in a spring market at the moment. It's the middle of June, and transaction levels are really high, even though property prices are perceived to still be very high versus income. And interest rates are at the highest level since 2007, where I think they were about 5.5%. So everybody is saying there is a crash coming. Some people are holding off as a result of that. But what I think is that the fall, the correction, has already happened. And what we are seeing now is actually a really strong recovery. And house prices are probably going to increase again as a result, back to the levels they were pre-Christmas and probably then some. So we just need to be really careful when we talk about house price crashes. There has never been a crash. It's unlikely there is ever going to be a crash. There will always be corrections, of course there will. But corrections can sometimes be masked by property prices versus our currency. And that seems to be what's taken place here that many people aren't talking about. But I think certainly worth highlighting when you're considering purchasing your next property. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the next video.